Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started.
Daria, smiling, also said that perhaps he felt even protected by her. The Empress explained that she was incredibly relieved to know that there had been someone with him all this time to take care of the boy, so she thought she should thank her in some way. Emma was incredibly embarrassed by such words. No one had ever said that to her before. Daria replied, however, that Yuri liked flowers very much, and she was glad that of all the maids, she was the one he felt the most affection for. So taking the brooch, she pinned it on the girl's work uniform and said she was sure he'd be nicer to look at her that way. In fact, the maid was always afraid of that woman's power, and because of that, she was unable to fully protect her child. And Emma wasn't sure if Her Majesty the Empress could forgive her for such an act, for she still felt guilty. For some time the girls were silent. Then the Empress turned to the maid and said that she counted on her continued support. And Emma replied in a very confident voice that she pledged herself to serve Her Majesty the Empress with all her heart. Soon afterward, the maid poured tea for the girl and turned to her, remembering something important. She immediately asked the girl what exactly she would like to give Yuri as a gift. Daria, hearing this, immediately laughed and told her all her plans. When Emma heard that Her Majesty wanted to purchase a shield for His Highness the Crown Prince, she was very surprised. And the girl explained that they have been completely out of stock lately, and getting them is also quite problematic. It was these words that the merchant who came to the Empress told them, and the girl, surprised, inquired whether there were no suitable ones after all, and would not be any time soon. The man replied that not at all, because everything would be able to be found for the Crown Prince's big day, so she needn't worry. He then showed her one of the shields and asked her what she thought of it and wondered if it would be suitable for the Crown Festival. Emma, upon seeing it, became very indignant, for it was only a fake, an imitation of a real shield. She couldn't believe that this salesman could treat the imperial family so lightly. But the man said with a smile on his face that he apologized, however. This was also the last remaining copy, and he definitely didn't have any others. Then Daria turned to the other salesman, whom she had also summoned, and inquired about the shields he had. He immediately bowed his head down and said he was sorry, but they could not prepare any. The guy said that they hadn't been able to find that shield that could fit His Highness the Crown Prince. Then Daria pointed her fan in his direction and said that he could go back inside. The other salesman smiled immediately, thinking it was his partner they were talking about. But at that moment, Emma came up behind him and began to brood, as it were, and the man was very much surprised, for he had not thought it had been said of him. And Daria, smiling, thanked him for all this time he had been carefully selecting goods for the imperial house. However, in view of this incident, she thought they should not see each other again. The vendor was incredibly surprised and couldn't understand what any of this even meant, since she hadn't even asked how much this shield cost. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't even understand how the emperor was even able to marry such a young baroness. Emma, hearing this, tried to keep her emotions in check, but then suddenly the salesman came closer to her and asked her if she wanted to go out together tonight. He also called her beautiful, but she pushed him, so that the man could not even stay on his feet and fell down. He immediately became indignant and asked what she was doing. But the maid inquired if he had not heard at all what the Empress had said. He pretended not to understand. Then she explained that even though he had been one of the imperial family's main merchants all this time, she found him useless, as he was only capable of offering goods of dubious quality for a high price. When the seller heard this, he was really surprised, for he thought that it was just a whim of the Empress, and it wouldn't be long before she would bring it back. And Emma replied that he could never again display his bald and ugly head and useless merchandise before the beautiful Empress, and then slammed the doors behind him right in his face. Afterward, she returned to the palace and bowed before the Empress and said that she was incredibly sorry. Daria looked at her in surprise, not knowing what she was talking about, and the maid explained that she was the one who had invited that merchant into the palace, so she asked that the mistress punish her according to her merits. But the girl came closer to her and pointed to something in the box. It immediately jumped right in her face, and Emma, even frightened, screamed. The Empress immediately started laughing and said that it was all very funny, and the vendor who was standing behind was watching in surprise, not realizing what was even happening. Then Daria explained that it was only because of her that she now had such a wide choice among all these beautiful gifts for Yuri, and wondered why she should punish her for it. Emma didn't understand how she could even say such a thing, because she really thought she was guilty in this situation. She was about to say something, but Mistress interrupted her. Daria explained that she wanted to choose a gift, and the maid did an excellent job of fulfilling her request. She would prepare the shield for the crown festival elsewhere, so she certainly didn't need to worry about that. The girl did not argue any further. Then the salesman, who was holding the paper in his hand, turned and said that he was very sorry to say this, but he must warn her. The young lad said that Duke Stagler had bought all the shields and swords in the entire country right before the crown festival, and he believes that this is the reason why it will be very difficult for the madam to find a suitable shield and sword for His Highness the Crown Prince. In fact, Duke Stagler's family was still a problem in imperial life. This duke was a cousin of the emperor. His main goal was to depose Yuri, and by any means to deprive him of the right to inherit the throne. And all he did was to make his son the next emperor, thus propelling their family to the very top. Daria's reason for marrying the emperor was to prevent Stagler from putting his successor on the throne. It was a loveless marriage, just so that an heir would be born into their family. So, with a smile, the woman said that they all didn't have to worry about the shield because she already had a plan in her head. She also thanked the merchant for telling her all this. Afterward, when he left, Daria turned to Emma, asking if she could trust her to deliver one letter to the city. It was very important and urgent. The maid was a little surprised to see this luxurious envelope, but said that she would do as she ordered. Before the merchant left, she also asked that he deliver 2 kinds of fabric and buttons by next week. She also showed him all the sizes and types of materials. Emma, hearing this, was very surprised and asked Her Highness why she was ordering all this in the first place. Of course, the mistress, smiling, told everything to the maid, giving it all to Johann in turn. When she went to send the letter, she recounted it all to Johann as well. The man, hearing about the young master's birthday party, immediately glowed with joy. But because of the boy's proximity, Emma asked that he stop screaming, because it was impossible for Yuri to hear about it. She also explained that Her Majesty the Empress wanted to help His Highness Yuri relax a little and relieve some stress before the crown festival. In fact, Daria wanted him to know that his birthday was the happiest and most joyous day of the year. And Emma, when she told Johann all this, smiled and said that she understood her perfectly well in these desires. The man thought for a moment, then said that when he was a child himself, his parents used to make an incredibly large pudding for his birthday, and they did all this despite the fact that the ingredients for it were very expensive. He also added that he remembered all these memories for the rest of his life and would never forget. Emma said that she was of course very happy for him. However, they would certainly not repeat such a thing. The man immediately felt bad about how much he had given in to his emotions, so he lowered his head and apologized to her for that. Still, he said that Her Majesty the Empress was trying very hard for His Highness the Crown Prince, and that was quite nice to see. Emma agreed, and then she looked at him and realized that the man was pretty easy to understand everything, and that surprised her a little. They were silent for a while, and after that, the girl inquired whether he would agree to cooperate with them or not. Johann thought that to hand over the signed document to the gentleman right at that moment would be very inappropriate, so he agreed to the girl's gamble and offered to make this birthday the boy's best. In fact, at all the previous crown festivals, Yuri was completely not smiling and was miserable. Closer to the date itself, everything around the estate began to be decorated with balloons, flowers, and of course the cake was being prepared. But even though Yuri's previous holidays had not been the most joyous, this time Daria wanted to get her words out to him. To tell him that she is so glad she had such a wonderful son like him, that's exactly what she wants him to know. The maids, when everything was finally decorated, were very surprised, and one of them wondered how Dasha had been so hectic in the Empress's palace the last time. Emma, smiling, replied that it was probably on the day when His Highness Yuri had just been born. At that moment, Daria came running up behind them, and with a smile on her face asked what they were talking about. She also explained that now every year there would be a similar commotion in her palace, for it is an important day that only comes once a year. At this very time, Yuri was already sitting at his desk writing some exercise. He looked a little upset. Then the doors to his room opened. He immediately thought it was the teacher coming and was scared beyond belief. Tilting his head as if to dodge a blow, he immediately apologized and said that he would speed up right away and finish the task by the appointed time. However, to the boy's surprise, it was not the teacher, but Johann. And when Yuri saw him, he was immediately pleased. The man, smiling, wondered if it was time for him to be done with his tasks for the day, because so sooner or later his brain just couldn't take it and would explode. Yuri, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what he was talking about. Then Johann, sighing heavily, replied that he had been ordered to take him to a very important place. He took the boy on his shoulders and told him that he was the colonel of the 5th Corps and the Lavarian Imperial Army Johann, so he must obey him without interruption. Yuri was very frightened when he found himself on his back and asked what he was even doing, but the man said he wasn't worried because he would carry him, and also asked him to hold on tight. He then cauterized his legs as much as he could in order to keep Yuri from falling off his head, and ran straight to the celebration his mother had arranged for him. But soon, when Johann did bring Yuri in, he did not look happy at all. The Empress, who was sitting beside him, was very anxious and didn't understand why the atmosphere had suddenly become incredibly dull. This made her very tense, because as soon as Mr. Yuri was brought in, he was incredibly surprised and delighted. His mom and a few other maids got into a circle and immediately started congratulating him. The maids activated the clappers, so Yuri was very interested. He could have cried for joy, but at that moment, Johann sat him down at the dining table, and the maid put a cap on his head. Then Emma spoke first. She brought a huge plate to the table, which was covered with a special lid, so that the boy would not see what was underneath before time. After that congratulations to Yuri, she opened the lid, and he saw under it a huge fruitcake with the number 6 on the very top. And he was incredibly surprised to see it and said it was all amazing. And Johann, seeing this cake, was also delighted and said it was incredibly festive. Then his mother came up behind Yuri and told him to make his wish and then blow out the candle. The boy immediately thought of his wish and blew out the candle. Then everyone immediately began to applaud and congratulate him. Emma actually made this cake herself, thinking of Mr. Yura, and said she tried very hard. The other maid replied that she had prepared many trinkets for him to play with if he got bored. And Johann brought out a whole bouquet of flowers and said that he made it with his own hands out of paper, and these beautiful flowers will stay with him for the rest of his life. When Yuri saw all this, he was very much astonished. However, he could not even utter a word. Then his mother, who was seated nearby, immediately congratulated the boy on his 6th birthday and said she was very happy to be present on such an important day. But he immediately became incredibly sad upon hearing this. His hands and body began to shake as if he was about to cry. Emma, together with Johann, were very much frightened. They ran up to him, and the girl asked, "Was the cream on the cake stale, and did he get sick?" And the army commander wondered if he might have traumatized him in some way while he was carrying him to this place, apparently putting his arms around his body too tightly. Well, Yuri, when he heard this, immediately said that it was absolutely not that. It was just that he was celebrating his birthday for the first time in his life, so it was all very unfamiliar and new to him. He also, with his head down, said that because of all this, he had to pull himself away from his studies, and he didn't get the maximum score on one of the assignments. His voice trembled, he was ready to cry. The cap fell off his head, and the boy said he was trying to practice fencing, but he was still very bad at it. And celebrating a birthday is an unacceptable luxury for him, so that's how he treats everything. When Daria heard this, she was very surprised. She came closer to him and told him that he was wrong after all, in just one question, and this was just a great result for him. She then took out a small toy in the shape of a blue penguin and held it out to the boy, saying it was a present for him. Yuri, seeing Mr. Penguin, was very surprised, and the woman explained that he could have it for himself, as she had specially bought it for him. He was about to object, but Daria, smiling gently, explained that penguins took very good care of their family and close friends. And the people who have gathered in this room are the people who care for Yuri as their family. The boy immediately thought of the meaning of the word family, for he had never thought of such a thing before. And Daria, smiling, said that on this day, she wished him to live a happy life with the people he considered close to him. Also, as she held out the toy, she said that she had made this penguin in the hope that he would have these wonderful thoughts and asked if he would accept her gift. Yuri immediately took the penguin for himself and, hugging it, laughed, calling this toy now his treasure. He thanked his mother for the gift and for making it with her own hands. Then the woman came closer and hugged her son tightly. He was silent for a while, and afterward he said that he wished this day would never end, for he himself was an unhappy man on earth. Also, Daria said that in addition, penguins are very hard-working animals, so you have to try harder. Yuri, upon hearing this, immediately smiled and told his mom that he would try even harder not to let her down. But Emma, hearing this conversation, was very indignant and asked what she was talking about, for Mr. Yuri works harder than anyone else. Johann came closer to them and, smiling, said that it was really so. He was even more of a laborer than he was. When the boy heard this, he said that it really wasn't true, was it? But Daria, smiling, told her son that he couldn't say that, for the truth is, he works very hard every day, which means that this penguin is Yuri's hard-working friend. The boy looked at the toy in surprise and thought about the fact that he was really his friend now, and his mother suggested that they should already start celebrating at last. After that, they all sat down at the table, and the boy finally tasted the fruit cake. He said it was incredibly delicious, and he even ate a few pieces. After that, they all sat around the table and played a board game. Of course, Yuri won because he was the birthday boy, and everything had to be in his favor on this day. Also, his mother was frightened by a toy in a box that pops out quickly. She had specifically bought it from a retailer to have such a laugh with her son. That day flew by very quickly for Yuri, and he went to bed cuddled up with his new toy, and Lulu was lying next to him. Because he was very tired, he even talked in his sleep, and Daria came to put him to bed and covered him with a blanket, thinking that he must be dreaming about the cake. The woman then went out the door and closed it behind her so quietly as not to wake the boy. But at that moment she suddenly noticed how her finger was bandaged, and remembered that when she was making this penguin, she had accidentally pricked herself. It amazed her how she had completely forgotten about it. It had actually been an incredibly long time since Daria had last picked up a needle, so it wasn't surprising that she had left herself wounded. In fact, she injected herself for the last time when she was in her 3rd month of marriage to her husband. As always, they had already poured together at the beginning of their married life, and the man inquired if she had done anything for the day. Daria was enthusiastic and said she had foreign language training in the morning and court training in embroidery in the afternoon. The man listened to her. However, he said nothing more. In fact, she was a little offended that they only met once a month, that he asked the same questions, and that he always answered the same way. However, that day she was going to take her first step forward in their relationship because she had made a very pretty doily in class. After dinner, the man rose from his seat and said that since she had no news especially, he was going back to his office. Daria immediately asked His Majesty to wait and grabbed even his sleeve. He looked at her in surprise but stopped. The girl was excited, but asked if he remembered praising her embroidery work the other day. Without waiting for an answer, she handed him the napkin and told him that she had made it in class that day, thinking of him. So she wanted to give the thing to Alexander specifically. But the man looked at this napkin and said in a gruff voice that he would not take it from her. He then turned around and started to walk away, and asked that she put any thought of doing anything for him with her hands out of her mind. Alexander explained that it was a gross waste of time, which she already had little of, so she'd better spend it on something useful. In fact, this napkin was a declaration of deep love, and the girl could not believe that His Highness might not know what it meant when a wife gave her spouse a hand-embroidered handkerchief. Then, in a trembling voice, she asked him what was the point of their dinners together if he wouldn't even accept a small gift from her. But he didn't say anything then, just walked away. It was from that day on that Daria tried to avoid using needles unnecessarily, but eventually she took up needle and thread anyway to make a toy for Yuri. As soon as she rounded the corner, she suddenly saw her husband not far from her and was very surprised, for she had not expected to meet him. Daria thought about the fact that this was a completely inappropriate time to see his face, or indeed to cross paths with him in any way, and was very upset about it. But Alexander, when he saw her, immediately started to come closer. But he didn't say a word. The girl spoke first and immediately wondered what he was doing here. Daria even got angry. She started yelling at him, asking why he was suddenly acting like this. She couldn't understand, because he didn't even show a single emotion on his face. But at that moment, the man suddenly moved closer to her, and their foreheads touched. When Daria felt it, she was very surprised, but she didn't say anything. The man moved away from her, looked her straight in the eye, and said she had a fever. Hearing this, she immediately touched her forehead to check if it was true, and didn't understand why he reacted to it like that at all. After all, His Highness was absolutely not the kind of person who could care about such things. Soon, however, he carried the girl into the room and laid her on the bed. She was really getting worse and worse. Her whole face was red, and her breathing was intermittent and very hot. The man began to question her and wondered what she had even been doing all this time, because he needed to figure out where she might have picked up germs. He looked at her suspiciously, and Daria said nothing to that. In fact, the Crown Festival was only a few days away, and she ended up coming down with the greatest fever. It was absolutely bad timing for her, as she was obligated to attend the event. When she felt a little better, the man asked the maid to prepare tea. Daria immediately started drinking it and explained the whole situation. She said her finger was bandaged because she had pricked herself while she was practicing sewing, and since it fell at night, she was so engrossed she hardly even slept. Hearing this, Alexander was very surprised and wondered if she had really started wasting time on useless things like sewing again. When she heard this, she was a little angry, for she didn't understand why he was still reacting so strongly to all of this. But after calming down a bit, Daria turned to him and told him that these were not useless things at all, because this day was special. It was her son's birthday. She also said she wanted to make him feel good, which is why she took up sewing, even though she hadn't practiced in a long time. Suddenly, Daria wondered if remembering Yuri's first birthday party was also considered a waste of time. Of course, she didn't ask about it. The girl set the glass aside and said that she could cure herself before the Crown Festival, and apologized for the inconvenience. She also wondered if there was anything else he wanted to talk about. Alexander folded his arms across his chest at that moment, but said nothing. They looked at each other for a while. Then he stood up and, bowing, began to leave the room. And before he did, Daria wondered if he really didn't want to discuss anything else, since she had thought otherwise. Alexander, without even turning to look at her, replied that he meant to say that they would change the date of the festival. But the Empress protested and said that it was absolutely not necessary to do so, and the festival should happen according to schedule. Then he turned around and said that the decision to return the Empress's palace rights had come, and wondered if she had already read the answer. When Daria heard this, she was really surprised, and the man replied that he had gotten to give it to Johann. But the girl actually had no idea what he was talking about at all, because her Han didn't even talk to her, and tried to avoid contact in any way at the party. Sighing heavily, Alexander said that the main thing was that he had to pass it on properly and didn't know if she had already been told or not. However, he signed the decision to return the rights of the Empress's palace. Daria, hearing this, was genuinely surprised and couldn't believe that he could actually do such a thing. But the man also added that despite this, he will continue to decide that he will be in charge of the Crown Prince's education, so he hopes that no objections she will have about it. The girl shuddered. Her hands began to tremble. Then she said that she also wanted to have a hand in her son's education. Daria wondered if he'd forgotten what had happened after he decided to hand over all authority to Miss Adelaide. She'd just ended up ruining the baby's life. He said that she might want to, but he did not know whether he could trust the teacher she had chosen, for he thought there would be a good chance that he might happen to be an assassin sent by the Duke of Stagler's family. And besides, if she is the one to take control of the Crown Prince's education, then all the detractors who only want terrible changes in their country's system will turn directly against her. He said she's young and inexperienced in politics, so she's unlikely to be able to compete with them. So in that case, she would just be crushed there and that's it. Of course, Daria knew exactly what he was getting at. The Duke of Stager still planned to make his son heir to the throne. And if she becomes responsible for Yuri's education, they will definitely use this opportunity to eliminate him. Nevertheless, in his previous life, Yuri was able to establish himself perfectly as the next emperor. This was only possible because the emperor's presence was a deterrent. And if the right to education goes to Daria, then everyone will be sure that His Majesty is just letting Yuri go, as if giving up on him. However, everything may happen again because the possibility that Yuri will be mistreated in the future cannot be ruled out. Daria wasn't feeling well at all. Her whole body was shaking, and it was starting to get dark outside. Alexander, seeing her condition, sighed heavily and said that was all he wanted to discuss with her for the day, so he started to leave. However, the Empress detained him again by starting to shout and asked him why she had not given her final approval on his decision at all. So they had not finished this discussion yet. Her whole face was red because of the heat and high temperature that was in her body. The man was annoyed by all this pointless arguing. He sighed heavily, said that he was trying to summarize, since she was running a fever and had loaded herself up a lot that day, and asked what else she wanted to say to him in general. The girl said with full confidence in her voice that she wanted to personally decide who would be in charge of the Crown Prince's education, and she wouldn't give up until she was authorized to do so. Then Alexander turned around and didn't say anything, because he just didn't know what to say to her about it, because he wanted to stick to his point of view. Before he left, Daria said in a trembling voice that she felt lately that he was only looking at Yuri from the perspective of a future emperor, not as a son. These words hurt the man, so he stopped and didn't even look at her face, but only asked in a cold voice what she wanted to say. Then she inquired if he had ever once in his whole life looked at Yuri, not as a future emperor, but as his own son through his father's eyes. Alexander, turning slightly, replied that this fellow was the Crown Prince, the next emperor who would rule this country. And he absolutely does not want to raise him to be a weak-willed man who will show his weaknesses to everyone. When he wanted to say something else, Daria interrupted him and said that, to put it another way, he had married her only for politics and was raising Yuri only for the country. This made Alexander insanely angry, so on his way out the door he said he'd had enough. He didn't want to hear any more of this. Daria immediately thought of the fact that he didn't even want to deny the fact that to His Majesty, Yuri was just a means to protect the country. There was absolutely no love at all in their marriage together, and her only role was only to give birth to an heir and nothing more. Of course, Daria had known that from the very beginning, but still, she didn't understand why she was still so sad about it. She must have hoped deep down for better things that never came to pass. Several hours had passed since then, and Alexander had already returned to his bedroom. He had changed into a nightrobe and was sitting on the couch by the small table. The man was holding a locket with a picture of his family in it. and next to it was also a frame with his wife and darling son. The man had many scars on his body because of what he had been through, yet he did not understand why things had gotten so difficult. Certainly, Alexander remembered well that terrible day on the battlefield when his older brother died before his eyes. If he had enough strength and skill back then, he still wasn't sure if he could have survived. The boy then began to be taken away, but he did not understand what they were doing, because his brother needed help. He was dying and needed support, but people did nothing, because they knew that he was already dead and could not be helped. When Daria gave him a handkerchief on their wedding anniversary that day, it reminded him very much of that day. That's why he reacted the way he did, saying he wouldn't take it away because he thought it was somehow the rag he used to try to stop his brother from bleeding. After a while, Yuri woke up and went to practice with his father. He was incredibly happy that he had come. So, after changing into a special uniform, the boy approached the man and thanked him for his time and for personally supervising his education. After that, he picked up the weapon and immediately started practicing, while Emma and his toy stood nearby and watched. Johann, who was standing next to the gentleman, did not understand why this man, for whom work is literally the meaning of life, suddenly decided to spend time with Mr. Yuri. After that, he turned to the gentleman and said that the Crown Prince has been showing more impressive ball skills lately. He also said he believes he's starting to get his hopes up right now to get into more serious practice sooner rather than later. And that's remarkable ambition and skills for someone who's only 6 years old. Alexander looked at the man in surprise and said that if he wanted it that way, of course, he could have it too. Because of this, Johann became a little uneasy and immediately fell silent. After a brief silence, the man also said that impatience clouds the mind and creates problems, so he should never forget that. Johann said that he agreed with him, and also that he would try to make sure that Mr. Yuri would remember it for the rest of his life as well. After all, otherwise it might end up too badly. At this point, Yuri continued practicing but accidentally tripped. The sword just flew out of his hands and straight toward Emma, who was standing nearby. The boy was frantically afraid for her and started running to save her. However, when he ran up, it was already over. Her arm was a little swollen, but she said it was fine. In fact, the sword hit her with its hilt, so it didn't even scratch her. The boy was incredibly frightened and immediately began to apologize to her. At that moment, Alexander came up to him from behind and asked him in a quiet, angry voice what he was thinking about during the training. Yuri immediately put his head down and said that since it was the first time his father had personally attended a training session in a very long time, he was starting to get distracted because of it. But Alexander interrupted him and said that if that sword were real, he would just take it and kill his own maid. Yuri, hearing these words, was immediately horrified. He started crying and said in a trembling voice that he was really sorry. He didn't want to get distracted and make such a mistake. But at that moment, Johann ran up to him and said, smiling, that there was nothing wrong with it. Failure is just an excuse to take things more seriously. Oh, and besides all that, if they went to the doctor now, they could prevent Emma from even getting a bruise. So he took the maid's friend and began to lead her away, saying that in that case they would go, leaving father and son alone. At that moment, Yuri dropped the weapons he had managed to pick up again. His hands were shaking, and he looked at them and wondered if he could really kill Emma. When Alexander saw the look on his son's face, he immediately remembered himself from his childhood, and he felt a little uneasy. After a while, he asked that Yuri look at him, and when the boy did, he told him to remember the feeling forever and never forget it. He also said that the boy should definitely remember that fear of losing someone close to him, and it is what makes a person stronger. Yuri, after listening to his father, immediately bowed and agreed with him. He also said that he was really terribly sorry that things could have happened like that. He hadn't thought about it. At this point, it started to rain heavily outside, so Alexander said that this was the end of their training session and for Yuri to go back to his room. Yuri quickly gathered all his things and headed back to the manor. They were all already soaked because the rain had started unexpectedly. At that moment, Alexander had a memory of his brother, as well as of his funeral. The boy was next to his brother's coffin and was crying, and behind him came his father, who with anger in his voice asked the boy why he and not his brother had survived. He talked about how he was the one who should have been in his brother's shoes, and Alexander didn't take his words as anything anymore, because he blamed himself for it. When the man returned to the manor, he remembered his wife's words and sighed heavily. After that, he realized that he hadn't seen the Empress in a long time. So the man went up to her room. Then a maid appeared behind him who, seeing His Majesty, immediately began to worry, for he was completely in wet clothes. The woman wondered if he had gotten so wet in the rain. Alexander confirmed this and also asked where the Empress had disappeared to. The maid thought seriously and said that she herself did not know, for she had not seen her since morning. Alexander looked out the window and wondered if the Empress could really go out in such terrible weather. Then he sighed heavily and asked that the maid prepare the carriage, for he would soon go in search of her. After a while, he arrived by carriage at an establishment. The man immediately opened the door and suddenly saw the Empress there, which surprised him very much. Daria, seeing Alexander in front of her, immediately wondered what he was doing in this place. She also indignantly said that the weather had deteriorated significantly and he decided to go outside. At that moment, some man's voice was heard behind her, asking the girl irritably who it was this time. He walked closer to the door and saw Klaus on the doorstep, which made him very surprised and even scared. The man quickly apologized and bowed. The two had actually met once before, but they pretended it was the first time. Alexander took the girl's hands and said that they would be leaving already, but Daria asked that he wait, for this man had not yet introduced himself to him. The man, hearing this, was very surprised and asked what she was even talking about. But the girl had no time to say anything, because her acquaintance spoke up and told Daria not to worry so much. He had made promises to her. He never breaks his promises. He scratched the spot on his face where the big scar was and said that in that case she shouldn't worry and better go where she needed to go. Daria immediately glowed with joy and thanked him for it, and he also told her to come back as soon as possible, for surely Crown Prince Yuri was already waiting for her alone. The girl called the man a hider and thanked him for it. After that, she went out into the rain together with Alexander. But the emperor also looked suspiciously at the man before he left. He quickly looked away, and Alexander thanked him for his help, which surprised the man very much. Soon afterward, they got into a wagon and drove away. Alexander kept having different memories in his head of the past. So as they rode back to the manor, the man remembered how one rainy day he had approached the knight and tearfully asked him why he had saved him. The boy didn't understand why he left his brother there. He kept talking about how he hated the man. See, that was the wrong thing to do. In fact, this hider was the very knight who had saved Alexander. So he told them to ask again if they ever needed help. While Daria was riding in the wagon, she kept looking out the window and thinking about the situation that was happening at the front. In fact, the hero who led the Elverian army to victory in the war between East and West 30 years ago was precisely the commander of the Imperial Army, Hayter Alos. But when she asked him for one favor, the man sent her a refusal, and when she came in person, he even yelled at her. For quite some time, the man kept getting stubborn. But the girl was still very glad that in the end everything turned out this way. The shield he had created would now protect Yuri for the rest of his life. Either way, she still didn't understand why she had to be so stubborn if she agreed anyway. He just wasted her nerves. The girl was also a little disturbed by the fact that of all the seats in the carriage, Alexander had decided to choose the one next to her. Because of this, she was very uncomfortable. Some time later, as the estate began to loom on the horizon, the man spoke up and inquired why she had suddenly come to hate her. Daria gave him a surprised look, then told him that she had asked him to make a shield for the crown festival. She also said that the sword and shield they were giving for their 6th birthday had great value and affection between the imperial family and the prince, and His Majesty the Emperor should understand that more than anyone else. Alexander agreed with her, but still said that Hayder was known as a stubborn and very troublesome person who certainly wouldn't agree to such trifles. Daria smiled and said that many people said that his head was so hard that it could be pierced by the fangs of a beast. Surprisingly, however, the rumors were very true. And despite all this, the man is a good person who can always cheer up. She also said that he was spoken of as a fine warrior whose work is admired by many sword masters. Alexander, hearing this, immediately smiled and said he understood. Daria paid no attention to his reaction, but turned and asked why he had come to this particular place for her, as well as how he even knew she was there. Of course, this was all surprising to her, for he had never cared for her, and it was safe to say that throughout all these years of marriage, he had not cared for her. So she didn't understand why he had arrived at that very moment at her place. But Alexander didn't react to her question. He just let it pass and turned away, pretending to stare out the window. It was immediately clear to the girl that he preferred to ask questions he wanted to know the answers to, and he didn't want to answer other people's questions. He then took a gold key out of his pocket and, handing it to Daria, said that now that Mrs. Adelaide was no longer with them, this key was not needed either. Also, Alexander added that it would be much better if this thing was kept by her. At that moment, the girl took it and was very surprised. She couldn't believe that he really wanted to give her that key, but then suddenly the wagon stopped and the coachman said they had arrived. In fact, the door to Yuri's room had never been closed since Mrs. Adelaide had left the castle, so she didn't need the key anymore. And that's why the girl just broke it off. After the wagon stopped, Alexander got out first and gave the girl his hand. She even stopped from surprise and just stared at the man, and the man, not understanding why she was not coming down, asked, "Is something wrong?" Daria realized she was acting a little strange, so she accepted his help and went downstairs. The rain had stopped by then, so you could even see stars in the sky. After that, the two of them walked towards the manor, and the girl was incredibly curious about what His Highness was thinking at that moment. Some more time passed from then on, and Johann was incredibly happy when the day of the Crown Festival finally arrived. He told Yuri that it was a very memorable day when they would finally be able to show Mr. to everyone. The guy also added that Yuri will need to impress a lot of people, so he better tune in. But the boy was already nervous, and when he heard these words, he stood in a stupor at all. Emma, seeing this, immediately became angry. She began to shout at the colonel and asked him to refrain from saying anything that might make Mr. Yuri worry. Johann, when he saw her like that, was very frightened. Then he said he was sorry. He didn't want to put the boy in danger like that. However, at that moment, Daria, who was already dressed in a beautiful dress, entered the room. When she saw her son, she immediately turned to him, and Yuri, hearing her voice, ran up to her and was very happy when he saw his mom, because she could only calm him down. The woman leaned over a little and said that the costume he wore for the party looked incredible on him. The boy was a little uncomfortable, but he thanked her for the compliment. He then looked at his toy and doggy, who were sitting nearby, and wondered what would happen if the Crown Festival didn't go the way it should. But Daria interrupted him half-heartedly and told him not to be discouraged, and everything would be very well then. He need not worry at all. She also said that she heard that he had accidentally stabbed Emma with a wooden sword during his last training session, and wondered what he was thinking after that. Yuri, putting his head down, said that he was incredibly sorry that he had traumatized her like that. But then Daria asked if he could take a look at Emma. Right away, the maid said with a smile that she was indeed perfectly fine, and she wasn't in any pain anymore and didn't even have a bruise on her arm. So he shouldn't worry so much. Yuri was still upset, and when he was about to object, the woman replied that she understood exactly how he felt. She too was sad when he was sad. Daria, at this point, approached the boy from the other side and said that surely everyone has to suffer failures, the consequences of which then have to be pondered over for a long time. However, one must also realize that life does not end on them at all, and he will definitely have a chance to make things right and try again. Also, with a smile, she said that only a small number of people get to do something perfectly the very first time. And getting setbacks is quite normal because he will still grow and gain a lot of experience. And in turn, he will help us, no matter how hard it is for them. Yuri was very pleasantly surprised by his mother's support, so he thanked her for it and wanted to say something else. But at that moment, a gentleman entered the room. Alexander was also dressed in a dressy uniform and told everyone that it was time for them to depart. By then, the young prince was already on alert, so he was set for any mishaps and all that. Soon after, when they arrived at the desired location, the butler introduced them as His Majesty, the Emperor, Empress, and Crown Prince. People immediately began to whisper. They were talking about how it was finally time for the Crown Prince to come out into the light of aristocrat society. In fact, all the people had been looking forward to this event, and they were very excited when the Emperor's family finally arrived at the hall. As soon as they saw Yuri, they immediately noticed that he radiated an aura of self-confidence, and with this, he was very similar to his father. However, the hair color many people realized he had inherited from the Empress, and that disappointed them a bit. Though with diligence and with the right clothes, the prince still looked quite spectacular, so this flaw wasn't very noticeable. After a while, the entire imperial family reached the special elevation, and they stood straight in front of all the people. As soon as the guests saw the stern look of Emperor Alexander, they immediately became uneasy. They did not know what to expect. But then the man looked at Yuri and waved slightly, letting him know he could finally start talking. The boy gathered his thoughts and spoke in a loud and confident voice. He greeted and thanked everyone for joining them on this day. Also, after bowing, he asked everyone to enjoy this wonderful event and rest properly. After that, the entire family of the emperor took their seats and watched people having a good time. Many girls immediately came up to Yuri and congratulated him on his birthday. The boy was very pleased with such attention and kindness, so with a smile on his face he thanked them all. But of course, Daria noticed that he was still a little nervous. However, everything was perfectly fine and under control. She was sure that many people gathered in that place that day would be personally convinced that he was worthy to carry the future of their empire on his shoulders. At this moment, Yuri looked at his mother and smiled happily. He was truly pleased that she was with him on such a crucial day. When some people had dispersed, she asked in a whisper if he was okay. Yuri immediately said that everything was fine and she shouldn't worry. Alexander, who sat between them, hearing this, even smiled slightly. But then suddenly the butler came up to him. He turned to Mr. Klaus and warned him as he had requested. The man immediately thanked him and said he could go. And following his assistant, he went straight from the hall, and immediately afterwards some man appeared in the festive room. Daria recognized him. He bowed, greeted His Highness the Crown Prince, and called him Son Ilari. Of course, Yuri became uncomfortable with the man, and with his head down, he thanked him. The man continued to insist and said he was honored to witness his social debut in person. Looking at him, he recalled how his Lucas also made his debut 2 years ago. He hasn't changed a bit since then, but his son had grown up a lot. Then Lucas stepped forward and asked his father if he could say something. The man said with a smile on his face that of course he could speak, and the boy, with a very menacing note in his voice, apologized to Mr. Crown Prince and said it was all just his father. He explained that his father had raised him so well that he had already succeeded in many things at the age of 5. And when he remembers how naive he was, he laughs involuntarily. Lucas also said that for a talented member of the royal family, he should be able to seriously fight with real swords as early as 5 years old. Therefore, with a smile on his face, he said that for sure, as the Crown Prince, he had already started practicing and had taken it seriously. Yuri, of course, was uncomfortable with this, because he, even with a wooden sword, cannot always cope, and this is already talking about a real Well, then suddenly his father turned to Lucas and said that he had embarrassed His Highness the Crown Prince a bit, so he apologized and took his son aside. The man then turned to the girl, saying that he had heard that Lady Otolade had left the castle, so he thought they must have found a more suitable teacher for her role. And also the man asked that they introduce their son to him, and he would be very grateful if the girl would do so. But, smiling, Daria said that she understood him perfectly well, because parents should choose a teacher taking into account the individual characteristics of their child. However, to put it another way, she said that Yuri's education would definitely be beyond his son. The man smiled upon hearing this and said that she was absolutely right, but what he really meant was that he didn't think it was normal to be educated by a useless brat like Yuri. He then bowed and said that his family wished them all the best during the Imperial Crown Festival. And Daria, smiling, thanked him for it and also said goodbye to Duke Stegler. Yuri felt simply disgusted after this meeting because he had doubted his abilities before, and now he felt even more unpleasant. But from that moment some time passed, and when the ceremony was beginning to end, Alexander summoned his son and, placing him in the middle of the hall, began to knight him. Daria stood nearby and watched from the sidelines with Emma. She was overjoyed when the sword was handed over safely, and then realized that it was her turn to take out a shield for it. She also thought about the fact that, judging from Duke Stegler's behavior, perhaps something would go wrong in the future. At the moment when the girl was about to take the shield and bring it out to her son, a knight suddenly came running to them and, bowing, said that someone had stolen the things she had prepared and he was very sorry about it. Emma was very surprised to hear this. She knew it wouldn't end well, but Daria didn't even blink an eye because she knew it would happen. After all, she still remembered that day from her past life. Right before the Crown Festival, it was very difficult to find shields, as Duke Stegler had trivialized them all. And right before the handover, Daria learned that the shield she had ordered from a neighboring country had been stolen by someone right before she was supposed to give it to Yuri. Then she did not know what to do, but Adelaide appeared with a wooden sword and told her to take it. Daria, upon seeing his appearance, immediately panicked and told the woman that she couldn't hand Yuri something like that on such an important day for him. Adelaide said that she understood that he would be laughed at for the rest of his life as a crown prince who was not recognized by the Empress, his own mother. However, she probably doesn't have any substitute for the stolen shield after all. She also said that her negligence had just ruined the prince's future, but this time it was completely different. And of course, after that incident in the past life between her and Yuri formed an even greater precipice in their relationship. For the boy did not understand how she could not acquire such an easy thing. In the end, the culprit was never found, and the fact of the theft before the ceremony was concealed to the last. However, now everything was completely different. Emma ran forward at that moment and told the guard that she would go and find that sword herself. But Daria stopped her and told her that everything was all right and she shouldn't worry so much. The maid looked at her in surprise, not sure what she was saying, and the Empress, with a smile on her face, said that she would go herself. At that moment, she missed Alexander and immediately began to go out to the people and her son. The man immediately looked at her warily, not sure what she was even up to. But at that moment, Daria came out to the people completely without a shield, and when the people saw this, they started to panic, not realizing what was happening. They were frightened, for they didn't understand why she hadn't brought anything with her, and they also assumed that Her Majesty didn't like the Crown Prince and didn't recognize him as a ruler. Yuri himself was very upset and surprised to see his mother without her shield. His body began to shake, and he didn't understand why she did that. But the woman came closer to him and told him that he was her precious son, and he shouldn't worry, just trust. At that moment, the doors opened quickly, and a man came into the hall. He panted and apologized to them for their tardiness. He had many scars on his face. However, he was dressed in festive clothes and said that it had been a long time since he had been dressed so formally. He was completely unused to how it should be worn properly and barely made it to the festival due to some difficulties. When Daria saw him, she immediately smiled and said that they had been waiting for him and introduced him as the great hero of their Ilvarian empire, namely, Hater Alois. When people saw him, they immediately started whispering and saying that he was Hyder Alois, the hero and key figure in the war between East and West. They did not understand why he had come to this celebration at all, for surely no one had invited him. After all, it was dedicated to an entirely different event. Even Duke Stagler was a little wary when he saw him, and especially Lucas. They didn't like the man much, but as soon as the man came closer, he got down on one knee and saluted Her Majesty, Moon Empress Hilary, and His Highness, the Star-Crowned Prince. He said he was a hater, a hero of their glorious empire, and as proof of his loyalty to His Highness the Crown Prince, he was presenting this shield to the Empress. As soon as Yuri saw this incredibly beautiful and expensive shield, he couldn't even contain his admiration. At that moment, Daria walked over to the man and carefully took that shield away. People immediately began to talk about it. They were surprised that His Majesty the Emperor had given the Crown Prince a sword that had been passed down between members of the imperial family for generations. And the Empress will present the Crown Prince with the Shield of Glory, which was made by a very real hero. They said it was the truest historical moment and will always remember it. After the shield was handed over, the man turned around and, very satisfied, began to leave, for he had done everything as it should have been done after all, even though he was a little late. Daria thought at that moment that this beautiful shield would protect her son safely in the future. She also said that his road ahead should be filled with nothing but bright light, and handed the thing to her son, telling him to take it. Yuri immediately got down on one knee and accepted this gift from his mother, thanking her profusely. Alexander at this moment stood backstage and watched all this with a little suspicion. He did not expect that the girl could take such a step for Yuri's sake. People kept starting to discuss and talk about the fact that the Ascian Ancient Force artifacts given to the prince had enveloped him with an aura of greatness that was worthy of an heir to the imperial throne. Also, the prince was recognized as a hero of the empire, which means that the future of their country will be very even bright and prosperous. Duke Stagler soon began to leave, for after all, he had not achieved what he desired. But before he could finally leave, Alexander intercepted him and said he was going home a little early this time. The man immediately turned sideways to see who was addressing him, and was very displeased when he saw who it was. And the emperor, seeing the surprised expression on his face, wondered if something had hurt him so much that he had decided to leave. The man immediately smiled strainedly and wondered why he suddenly thought so, because rather he was very happy to be able to face the magnificent image of His Imperial Majesty the Crown Prince. He also said that in the future he would definitely only carry death. The man suddenly started laughing and said that it was simply incredible that the heir of such a formidable emperor had been honored with the recognition of the empire's hero himself. The very fact caused him to feel the greatest emotion. Alexander agreed with him and said that at least he was his own son and direct heir, not from a side branch of the family that was only in the business of stealing titles. The man, hearing this, asked with a smile on his face what he meant by that, and also added that he should leave already, as he had other things to do, and his son was going to stay at the ball until the very end, so he asked to watch him. Without waiting for an answer from the emperor, he simply turned around and began to leave. And at that moment, many girls appeared behind Alexander, who again wanted to congratulate him. Many hours had passed since then, and the sun was beginning to set outside. Daria stepped out onto the terrace to catch her breath. She was certain that Duke Stagler was behind the theft of the ceremonial shield. They had tried to examine the entire room where it had been kept, but no evidence had been found. This man was the kind of person who would not let himself be caught by the tail so easily. But she was still glad she'd been able to safely hand the shield over to Yuri. At that moment, her son came out onto the terrace. She was immediately happy to see him and said that the suit was incredibly beautiful. He had changed it to look more impressive. The boy immediately thanked her and told her that Emma had brought it for him to change his outfit. Afterward, he suddenly put his head down and said that he wanted to talk to her about that ceremony. Yuri was very nervous and even embarrassed, so he blushed all over and thanked her for giving him such a beautiful shield. He hadn't expected that such a thing could happen. Daria immediately smiled and said that he had absolutely nothing to thank her for, because in fact, for being so accepting of her and treating her so well, she was the one who should be grateful. They stood in silence for a while. After that, Yuri moved closer to the edge and said that he had thought about doing everything that concerned his powers for the Empire. He wants to do the best he can, and he's going to train very hard to do it. When Daria heard these words, she immediately smiled and said that she believed he could do it all. She also said that he would definitely make a worthy crown prince, since he is her son, and it certainly can't be any other way. The boy was encouraged by her words and said he felt incredibly warm in his chest after all the conversations he had with her. He then looked around so that no one would overhear them, and asked in a whisper if she was a sorceress, and said that she must answer him honestly, for he must know. Daria immediately laughed and said he had figured her out, and asked if she could cast an incentive spell as a reward for his hard work. Yuri, of course, agreed. After that, she took him in her arms and showed him to a clearing near the estate, which directly bloomed with various beautiful plants. As soon as Yuri saw this beauty, he couldn't believe that it was really real, because the sun was also falling very beautifully on all these different colors. Daria, smiling, said that it was indeed a beauty, and this enchanting power, like a warm fire, warmed her soul too. And since he was her son, he had magic blood in his veins. She also asked him to remember that true magic is born in the heart when it is full of joy and happiness. She winked at the boy and said that she felt very warm inside after every time they talked. When Yuri heard this, he was very surprised and asked if it was really true. Then he turned his head to the side again as she waved at him in agreement, and for quite a long time they gazed at that beautiful field of flowers. Then Daria put him back on his feet and told him to get back, for the ball was about to begin, and he must be there. Before they left, Yuri hesitated a little. He wanted to say something to his mother, but he was shy, and at that moment he remembered that she had said that he could share absolutely anything he wanted with her. Then, plucking up courage, he said he would like to give his first dance to her. So Yuri reached forward and asked if he could ask her to dance. There was hope in his eyes. As soon as Daria heard this, she was immediately overjoyed, for it was the first time he had opened up to her about his feelings. She, without thinking long, immediately took his hand and said that of course she would dance with him. After that, they laughed and went back to the hall. Before they went in, however, she said she needed to change too, and asked if he could wait for his dance partner for a while. Yuri just glowed with joy and said that of course he would wait for her. He went inside. There was nice music playing, and he stood aside, waiting for his mom. It had been a long time since then, but his mother still hadn't come. He was starting to get a little worried when suddenly someone else approached him. It was Lucas. He turned to Yuri with a smile on his face and said that it was the crown prince after all. He walked closer to him and asked if they could go outside and talk for a while, for he had some questions that only he could answer. Yuri immediately became worried, but there was nothing else for him to do but follow Lucas. Alexander, who at this moment was standing among the ladies and sipping wine, noticed this at once and became wary. By that time it was completely dark outside. As soon as they left the hall, Lucas immediately took Yuri's hand and started pulling him quickly toward the fountain. Soon, however, he managed to escape from his grasp. The boy stopped nearby and wondered if he had really been recognized by the hero himself. The crown prince was very frightened and didn't know what he was talking about, so he asked what he meant. Lucas turned to him and immediately started shouting and said that Mr. Hader had openly told everyone before he retired that he wouldn't take on any apprentices. And even while making a living as a blacksmith, all he took on was just repairs and nothing more. However, this time he forged a shield for Mr. Yuri with his own hands. He kept shouting at the boy with complaints and asked why he had recognized him out of all of them. At that moment, Alexander also went outside. Seeing that something was not clear, he followed his son so that he could help him in case of emergency. He stopped not far from the boys and watched their conversation so that he could intervene if anything happened.